Hi guys, welcome back to the Unlimited Expedition. This week on Tech TUElk, I'm going to show you how to change a Jeep rear wheel bearing in the bush. Check it out. One thing about Jeeps is that they're very easy to fix, so that wheel bearing should only take me about half an hour, provided you've got the right equipment. So what do you need? First thing you'll need is a wheel brace to remove your wheel and tyre. Then you'll need a jack. I always prefer to use a bottle jack. You'll need a set of pliers, an 18mm spanner, a flat nose punch, a cold chisel, a good hammer and a pinch bar. A block of wood is essential. So is an angle grinder with a flat cutting disc. It's always good to have brake cleaner and penetrating oil handy as well. Remote sort of driving like this, you should always have a spare wheel bearing handy. One for the front, one for the back. These in Australia are quite expensive. I think they're about $80 for just one wheel. And the front wheel hub assembly in Australia is probably about $300, and that's from a very cheap supplier. If you go to Repco or something, you'll be paying a lot more. Very expensive car parts in general in Australia. Do yourself a favour guys, jump online, get it early from the United States. It takes about a week and a half to get here. But for example, I think these are about $15 per unit as opposed to $80 from the local supplier. Your first step is to remove your wheel and tyre assembly. Put it under the car like this. So I've only got one jack. Now if that fails, that may very well save me being seriously injured. Your next step is to remove your brake caliper. Now it's got two 18mm bolts at the back, and you will need to get your hammer and pound that because they're going to be very, very tight. Once we get that off, we'll be able to get the axle out. Now if you've got super long brake lines like me, you can rest your brake caliper on the ground without too much trouble. If you don't, you'll have to tie it up to the sway bar or something to keep it out of the way. Don't let it dangle from that brake line. Now that we've got the brake rotor off, we can pretty much see the play in there. Now the next step, I've got 4 bolts at the back that need to be undone, and then the axle will come out. Again, it's an 18mm spanner that you will need to get those nuts off the back, and they are very tight. Be very careful. On the retainer in here, the head of the bolt is actually just knurled and pressed into the retainer, and that head can actually turn around as you're undoing this. So what I like to do is put some penetrating oil on the back to minimize the chance of any binding and minimize the chance of that spinning. Once that starts spinning, you will not be able to get it off. You will need to get a welder and weld the head of the stud to the bracket to get it undone. If your wheel bearing is as bad as mine, you'll find that the axle will just slide out. Now if it's still in reasonable condition, you won't need a slide hammer. All you need to do is put the brake disc on like this, put a couple of wheel lugs on like this, opposing each other, 2 or 3 turns. Probably best to put a third one on there too. And that gap basically turns this assembly into a slide hammer. So you can use that to bash it back and forward, and it will break the bond. Just be careful of your ABS sensor, that's it there. Don't want to scrape the face of that when you pull this out, so just be very careful. So that's it there, all apart. You don't need to worry about an inner seal in the differential. There isn't one on the rear axle. That's your axle flange, that's your ABS tone ring. That's the little retainer, bearing retainer, as I was talking about. And they're the pressed in heads with the knurling on the inside. They tend to spin if the nut binds on the outside, and then you're really buggered. You got a bearing seal, the bearing itself, and a collar. While you've got the axle out, now this is not a stock axle, this is a aftermarket nitro axle and gear chromoly axle. But nevertheless, you want to check your splines. Is there any evidence that you've got any curling or chipping or wear of any sort? You can see I have got a reasonable amount of wear in there. I mean, these axles have probably done probably about 120,000 kilometers since I put them in. the wear there doesn't look particularly bad. I'm okay with it. Now the other thing you got to be careful is not to get dirt all over that. You definitely don't want dirt on the splines there going back into the differential. So what I tend to do is just put a rag over it, tape it up with duct tape, and then when you're banging it around it won't pick up any dirt, because we are going to have to lie it over when we cut that bearing off. Now this is my $21 angle grinder that I bought from Bunnings, and it's been a cracker so far, I tell you. Well worth the money. All I do is I plug it up into my inverter, and that's a max power 3000 watt continuous power 1500 watt inverter, and that's much better for me to have an electric grinder like this. It's more powerful and does the job better than having a battery powered grinder. I know a lot of people have the battery ones. They're not a bad idea, but for me this is cheaper and works better. So what I've got to do here is first cut through that collar. So I put a slot probably 3/4 of the way down, and then I can jam a cold chisel into it. And the tricky part is to actually cut the bearing off. So the first thing we want to do is cut the race off, get rid of the rollers and the race, and then we look at the intersection of the bearing. So you can see here that I've put a nice slice through the collar and one up through the bearing race. Hopefully that's enough for me to split both of those off, and then I can worry about the inner part of the bearing. You need to always carry a good cold chisel like that. I'll put that in there and then give it a good hit, and there it is. It's come loose, so that'll come off. The next bit is to get this off. It shouldn't be too much of a drama. Balls are going to go everywhere, but that's life. Just watch you don't cut yourself on any of the sharp parts. Now you can see that's the seal there. That should just slide over once you got that stuff off. You can see I've got a lot of oil on the outside of that seal, so that's bearing's been on the way out for some time by the looks. Now the only thing we've got to do is get this inner part off. That is super hard steel and wear eye protection. First thing we're going to do is put a slot at about 45 degrees on this side. Try and get it right down to the axle. You can see that there's a little bit of a cut there. Now that was probably from the last time I did these bearings. A little nick like that won't be the biggest thing in the world, but you want to try and avoid doing it anyway. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put a slot on 45 degrees there. I'm going to turn it around, do the other side at 45 degrees, and then I'm going to try and split them apart. So you can see my slots there. It's difficult to get up this end because you've got that shoulder. I really don't want to take a piece out of that shoulder. So what I'm going to do, put my chisel in there like that and break it open. Wear your goggles. I was pretty lucky. I didn't need to break it all the way through. The two slots were enough to relieve tension on that, and it basically slid off. You can see that I've put a little bit of a cut in the bearing seat. I'm not happy about that, but what can you do? Alright, so the next thing we're going to do is clean this up. I always like to carry a couple of cans at least of this brake cleaner. You pick it up at Repco for a few bucks when it's on sale. That makes really light work of cleaning stuff like this up. Now for your reassembly, you've got to put this collar on. Now you can bang it on with the punch and the hammer, but I like to get my burner out and really get some heat into it. That'll expand the ring and it'll slip on a lot easier. You can't see the flame coming off there because of the daylight, but she's going alright. We'll get that nice and hot. That'll take about 5 minutes. And then that'll go on a lot easier. In the meantime, I'm going to start the assembly. So it's imperative that you get this in the right order. So the first thing that goes on is the bearing retainer, and it's obviously got to face inwards. The next thing that we put on is the oil seal. Again, the oil seal has to be in this orientation. You put it the other way around, it's going to be a really big pain in the bum to pull it all off again. So one thing I do like to do is put a little bit of grease or oil around this seal just to give it a bit of lubrication. Just make sure it sits like that. The next thing we need to do is get the bearing on. Again, the bearing has to be on the right orientation. That little ring on the outside, that goes to the outside of the axle. Now we're going to have to pound that on with a punch and a hammer. So what you want to do is go around evenly, just with fairly light taps. You can see that bearing slowly making its way down. It's very important that you only strike on this inner race part. If you strike on the outer part, you'll damage the bearing. When you feel a punch bounce back like that, you know that you're seated. Just go around a couple more times just to make sure it's seated all the way. And then of course just check your gap underneath, and that's home. Also be very careful that you don't introduce any dirt. It's good to have that bit of grease at the top so you can just wipe it off. Now you can see that's got a bit of a bluish shine to it. Hopefully that's hot enough. Now I'm getting to the point where the shoulder is coming into view. Now you really want to be careful that you do not pick that shoulder up with your punch, otherwise it'll be very difficult for the next time you do it. So when you feel that punch bounce back, you know that you're going to be home. So we're pretty close there now. I think we're home, but I like to just go around a few times. So absolutely make sure, because any movement there will cause bearing failure. Now you can see that I've really damaged the top of that ring. That doesn't matter at all. There's nothing that bears on that surface. That's simply a retaining collar. Now just make sure you haven't put any dirt or there's no metal chips or anything that have just gone into that bearing. And just wipe out that grease. So the next step is we've got to try and get this collar out, or the outer race, the cup. So what I do is I just go around with a pinch bar like so, and it generally just walks itself out without too much trouble. You just got to be really careful and quite even about it. So that's the axle assembly there going back in. There is this little indentation here on the bearing retainer. That's to clear the ABS sensor, so you got to make sure that lines up. Actually, it doesn't really matter which side, both sides have an indentation. You don't need to put any grease on the bearing. There's grease in the bearing, and the idea is that the diff oil will flow into the tube and eventually start lubricating that bearing, but that grease that the bearing comes packed with will keep it going until that process starts. Make sure everything is thoroughly clean and there's no dust or dirt on anything. It's a bit hard sometimes in the bush, but just do your absolute best. One last thing you should do before you put the bolts on the back of the retainer is make sure it's all fitting nice. So that bearing retainer, difficult to see with the sun, but that bearing retainer is actually sitting flush against the back of the axle, or the axle tube flange. So that's how it should look. It takes a bit of jiggling to get the whole assembly in and give it a few good taps, but it should all be flush, and you shouldn't be having to compress anything with that bearing retainer. That's looking pretty good to me. Give it a bit of a turn and a bit of a wobble. See, there's no up and down or radial play, and there's basically, I haven't got the bolts on yet, and there's basically no lateral play either with me just using my hands to push it. Again, put some penetrating oil on those bolts, or better yet, put some anti-seize on there. If that binds, you're going to be buggered. Now, I've just got those nuts nipped tight, so I'm going to give a final check. That feels really good. There's no play in any direction. At the back, make sure that the same portion of bolt is poking through on all 4 of the nuts. And once you're happy with it, I mean, that's it. That's pretty good. That feels excellent to me, and I'm pretty confident that'll be a solid repair. So now I'm going to put the brake rotor on, put the brake caliper on, and the tyre on, and we're done. Now that the tyre is back on the car, I'm going to jump under and check the oil level in the differential, because if it's been leaking, there's a chance that the oil has gone down below the required level. Thanks for watching, guys. See you next time on the Unlimited Expedition.